So just when you thought that you didn't have to listen to me today, here is the start of your Chapter 3 notes. So listen to this today, fill out your notes, and use this to start working on your practice packet. We're going to move into Chapter 3 now, which is very different than the biochemistry information that we just came from. Chapter 3 is our start to ecology, and so we're going to define what that means and move into that. And this is actually covered in Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6, so we're on to a larger unit of study here from this point forward. So our essential questions. Biggest thing here that we're looking at: how do the living and non-living parts, didn't mean to move that, of the earth interact and affect the survival of organisms? So what we're looking at here is ecology is sort of the study of our planet, but we're more interested in the living things on our planet, or the biosphere, and how those living things interact with each other and interact with non-living things as well. So we're going to look at how we study living things. We're going to look at how we get energy. We're going to look at how this energy moves around through an ecosystem. And then we're going to look at cycles later on down the line here. So we have our characteristics of living things, right, that we learned in the first chapter. Now with all of ecology, our focus is going to be this one. Right? Living things respond to their environment. We talked about how you have a stimulus and we all respond to it. We're going to go a lot deeper into this statement now and see exactly what this means to respond to your environment and interact with the things around you. Okay, so what is ecology? So ecology, before we get to that, we want to look at what the biosphere is, and we've already seen this year. But biosphere literally means living planet, and this is a reference to all the living things on Earth, as well as all the parts of the Earth in which life exists. So the biosphere, there's sort of like a top and a bottom to it, right? If we go deep enough into the Earth, we wouldn't be able to sustain life anymore, so the biosphere stops. If we go high enough into our atmosphere, we get to a point where we won't sustain life anymore, and so life stops. So the biosphere is kind of the in-between, so where we are a little ways down and a little ways above us. Ecology, then, is basically the study of the biosphere. Ecology, the stem of this is a Greek word oikos, which means house. So literally ecology means study of our house. The better definition, or sort of the book definition here, is that this is the scientific study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment. So again, study of living things, the way they interact with each other, and everything else around them as well. Just as a side note, economics is also derived from oikos, but this is the study of money. So basically economics means money of our house, but we're not talking about that at all in here. Okay, so we have the levels of organization. They are going to follow us all the way through this year, and so we've discussed most of these already. We'll come back to these now, again, because now in ecology we're looking at big things. So we started out very small, right, with molecules last chapter, and soon enough we'll be back on to cells and little things like that too. But what we're interested now is what are the levels of organization for the individual and up. So if we look at an individual organism, we see a group of organisms, and before we said if you were the same type of organism living in the same place, that was a population. That's still true. But now we want to add a new vocab term, and that's the term species. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species and the same area. And so a species is a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. We'll explore that a little more later this year, but the idea is if two organisms can mate, produce a baby, and then that baby can have babies, then you qualify as a species. So that's what we mean by being able to breed and produce fertile offspring. The question is, can the offspring also have kids? So for instance, you've maybe heard of a liger before, right? If we take a tiger and we cross it with a lion, this doesn't happen in nature. Those two things kill each other in nature. But if we tried to force them to do that somehow, we could produce offspring, referred to as a liger. But ligers cannot reproduce. So because ligers can't reproduce, we know that lions and tigers are actually separate species. Now if we go a little bit bigger, okay, we learned before, population, same species, same area. Community is all the different populations living in a defined area. An ecosystem is basically a community, but also the physical, non-living environment. So we include water and rocks and all that kind of stuff then. Then we got a new one here, and that's biome. A biome is a group of ecosystems showing similar climates and typical organisms, defined by biotic and abiotic factors. So we'll define these terms here in just a second. These page numbers are probably not accurate anymore. Shouldn't have left those in there in terms of your iPad version of your book now. But biomes, we're not going to spend a lot of time on. There's a little bit of information in the book, but biomes are basically a group of ecosystems with a lot of similarities. So for instance, something like a desert, right? We all know what a desert is. Deserts can be found on several different continents, so they can be in very different places across the planet. But if we go to one desert, it's going to be very similar to all the other deserts. And so you see similar things here too. Tropical rainforests, right? Can appear on multiple continents. They're always going to have similar climate, right? Similar features, similar organisms that live there. Temperate woodlands and temperate grasslands are kind of like where we live here in the United States. You can also have different types of forests, and then the tundra is the frozen lands up north. So biomes, bigger than ecosystems because it's a group of ecosystems. And then the biggest thing, as it was before, is the biosphere. So this is your entire planet, at least the part that can sustain life or is living. Wow. Yeah, living. Okay, so that last slide mentioned biotic and abiotic factors. Here's what those terms mean. The biotic factors of an organism are all of the biological influences on that organism. So this is everything living in our environment that an organism might interact with. So if we're looking for an organism's biotic factors, we look for anything that is alive or was once alive in the environment around us. This means that biotic factors could be other living animals or plants, could be the foods an organism eats, could be all sorts of things. But what we look for is, okay, was this thing alive at some point? Is it alive now? If the answer is yes, then it is a biotic factor. So this could be animals, this could be plants, this could be fungi, this could be bacteria. There's lots of different things that we could be looking at here. Now, if we ask the question, what biotic factors does a robin interact with? First, the easiest answer is other robins, right? So you guys are the same way. If you are a human, you interact with a lot of other humans. But this robin also has a lot of other biotic factors. For one, this tree that the robin is sitting on is a biotic factor. These worms would be things that the robin eats, biotic factor. As well as these seeds, which come from plants, would be a biotic factor. The nest, right, is made up of mostly twigs, leaves, that sort of thing, so also biotic factor. These eggs would be biotic because they are currently alive. Now other animals can factor in too. Other birds, like these predatory birds, or a predator like the snake, would be a biotic factor. And then of course, the main biotic factor of robin is Batman. Get it? Batman, Robin. If you don't get it, ask your friend. Okay, now the other thing is abiotic factors. And basically, if we put an A out in front of a word, it means not. Right? So abiotic factors are not biotic. These are simply physical components of the ecosystem that are not alive. So when we look for abiotic factors, you are looking for things that are not alive and have never been alive. So for instance, what we look for here is things like sunlight, heat, precipitation, wind, water, parts of the soil, and that sort of thing. So if we stick with our example from before, abiotic factors for our robin, wind would be a big abiotic factor, right? Affects how that robin flies, how warm or cold it is, etc. Temperature, also a big factor. We've talked this year about birds flying south for the winter. So the temperature outside is going to have an effect. Water or precipitation is huge, right? We need water to keep us alive. So while water itself is not living, it is a very important abiotic factor. And then, just to stick with our Batman reference, Robin would have the Joker. But don't let this confuse you, okay? This is just to try to be funny, which probably didn't work anyways, but he would be biotic, right? Now, it might seem like this is simple, right? Very clear. But in reality, these things intermingle, and it can be a little bit more complicated. Your environment is filled with biotic and abiotic factors, and sometimes it's hard to identify what is what. For instance, something like a twig, you might think, oh, it's dried up, it's dead. Even still, it came from a living thing, so it's biotic. Same thing, let's say there is a dead carcass of something laying there, so there's some dead fish floating around in here too. If that's the case, those are still biotic factors. Even if they're currently not living, they were at some point. So it can be a little trickier than it may seem. Now, on to energy. Energy is extremely important. We have to have a constant input of energy to keep our systems in order, and to keep our body working correctly, our cells working correctly. So the question becomes, where does this energy come from? Now, thanks to chemistry, physics, and biology, we have a couple of laws of thermodynamics. And so the first one is the biggest one that we want to focus on. And the first law of thermodynamics is also known as the law of conservation of energy. And this is the concept that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So in other words, there's a set or finite amount of energy in our universe. What we see is that this energy moves all around us, getting passed along from organism to organism and changing forms as it goes. And you guys might have done a little bit of this sort of stuff in school before. This would not be on our test, but you might remember in science in junior high, you might have talked about potential versus kinetic energy. This idea is if there's a ball at the top of a hill, it has potential energy. But once it starts to move and roll down this hill, then we say that it has kinetic energy. Now again, this is not something that I will test you on. But in this case, there's a set amount of energy. It just changes form from this kind to this kind. And we see this in a chemical way in all organisms as well. So for us, energy comes from somewhere, originates somewhere, and passes along from organism to organism. Now this is my brother. My brother's a real exciting guy. He really does not like to dress up for Halloween, so one time, a long time ago, I made him wear my Buddy the Elf hat for Halloween, and he was really excited about it, as you can see here. As humans, we eat other organisms, right? So let's say you eat corn on the cob. Clearly you're eating a plant, and you get energy from that plant. But let's say you're not so healthy, and you eat a big hamburger. That is a whole bunch of other organisms, right? The beef is from a cow. The cheese is probably processed from cow milk. Lettuce is a plant. The bun is a bread product, so that comes from plants. So basically everything we eat is eating other organisms, and they get their energy from other organisms. So for instance here, the beef that's in here from a cow, it got its energy by eating corn or grains of some kind, and then pass the energy on to us. But ultimately, everybody gets their energy from the sun, right? Solar energy. So the first type of organism that we see is called an autotroph, and these are also referred to sometimes as primary producers. This is my term for this, nothing official, but I like to call autotrophs self-feeders. Autotrophs can capture energy from the sun or from chemicals and convert that energy into other forms that living cells can use or living cells can store away. So in other words, these organisms, these autotrophs, take inorganic compounds, things that aren't alive, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and they make nutrients out of it. So they make organic compounds out of those inorganic compounds. Autotrophs, therefore, produce what we could call food energy. Notice in quotes there. That's not a real kind of energy. But autotrophs can convert sunlight, so solar energy, into chemical energy. And chemical energy is the energy that we find in like carbohydrates or proteins or those sorts of things. So the autotrophs are going to include the plants, you see here. They're going to include green algae, like you see in an aquarium here. And they're going to include some green bacteria, like you see right here. And all of these guys can take solar energy from the sun and convert it into a chemical form of energy. The way they do this? Photosynthesis. This is the process by which we use light energy, turn it into chemical energy that can power living organisms. In other words, photosynthesis is taking solar energy and turning it into carbohydrates. And again, this is performed by the things on the last slide, so plants, algae, and bacteria. Here's the chemical reaction for this. We're going to take solar energy, combine that with carbon dioxide and water to give us oxygen and sugars, carbohydrates. We'll come back to this whole photosynthesis thing a little bit later this year, but for now you just want to know that this is how an autotrophic organism generates carbohydrates. Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. I really just threw this in here because we had that microscope lab and we already kind of saw these terms. If we look inside a plant leaf, we've got several different plant cells here, and then inside that cell you're going to find chloroplasts, and they have a somewhat complicated structure. Like you see here, there's two membranes, then there's these little sacs inside of here called thylakoids, and inside there you're going to find chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the chemical that does photosynthesis. So just a little bit of background, and we'll get into this structure a little more later this year too. Now there is one strange alternative, and we're going to see it on this slide, and we're really kind of done with it, but I do want to bring it up, and that is that there are also organisms that are autotrophic, so they can generate energy, or chemical energy, but they're not photosynthetic. These organisms do a process called chemosynthesis, which is where they use inorganic compounds or chemicals, turn those into carbohydrates without the use of sunlight. Now this is huge in places where there's not sunlight. So if we looked inside of a cave, or this is a picture of a deep sea vent at the bottom of the ocean, if we've got bacteria that live in those places and there's no sunlight, they can't do photosynthesis. So we need a different way to produce, right? And the way that they do this is using sulfur compounds. So sulfur compounds are not organic, they're not living, and they're not going to give you any nutrients. So these organisms have a process to take carbon dioxide and oxygen, combine it with sulfur compounds to produce different sulfur compounds, but then more importantly, sugars that organisms can use for energy. Now, as you saw, we are not autotrophs, right? We are what we refer to as heterotrophs, or sometimes called consumers. Now, the heterotrophs are called consumers because we must consume other organisms to get energy. We can't go out and harness energy from the sun like producers. I don't know about you guys, but if I go in my backyard and I take my clothes off and I stand out in the sun, I'm not going to develop energy, right? If anything, you guys have probably done this before. If you're out in the sun all day long, like let's say you go on vacation at the beach, even if you just lay in the sun all day, it wears you out, right? So we are not autotrophic. We can't stand in the sun and develop energy that way. So we have to consume other organisms to get our energy. like this yummy snack right here. Now, autotrophs are autotrophs. There's no subgroups in those, but heterotrophs we classify into a whole bunch of different groups. Most of these I think are going to sound familiar to you, but we'll just run through them real quick. And they're classified based on how they get their energy. In other words, what they consume. So our first group are the carnivores, or meat eaters. These organisms rely strictly upon meat or animal tissue for their food. They will hunt down and kill and eat other animals. And while hunting can be quite difficult and require a lot of energy to chase down an organism or something like that, the reward is huge, because if this wolf hunts down a rabbit, it might be kind of hard to do that, but when they catch the rabbit, they can eat the whole rabbit. Same thing for the lion on the last page. It might be hard for that lion to chase down a zebra, but then it can eat the whole zebra. So it will get a lot of energy, kind of payoff for exerting its energy to hunt. Now, the exact opposite of a carnivore is an herbivore, or a plant eater. Herbivores rely strictly on plant products for their food, so they do not eat meat in any way. Now, herbivores can be unique because they can eat all different kinds of plant products. So they might eat leaves, they might eat roots, they might eat fruits or vegetables that come from plants, they might eat seeds. It doesn't really matter what part they eat. If an organism relies heavily on plants, they're an herbivore, and so a cow is a good example of an herbivore. Third group, look out, creepy Mr. Burton picture here. Third group are the omnivores, and I call these guys both eaters. Omnivores include a variety of plant and animal matter in what they eat, and we really depend upon having both plant and animal nutrients in our diet. So even though a lot of people think of bears as being like scary and ferocious, bears are omnivores. They really eat as many berries as they do any kind of animal that's out there. Pigs are omnivores. They'll really eat anything you put in front of them. Now, pigs don't tend to hunt down other animals and kill them or anything of that sort, but basically you can put any kind of stuff in front of a pig and it will eat it. And then humans, right? You guys might kind of prefer. That's why my creepy picture is here. You guys might prefer plants or animals or salads or whatever, but you eat it all, right? We eat a balanced diet as humans of plant and animal material. One thing real quick to say that is really important is that it does not matter what your choices are in what you eat. If you are a human, you are an omnivore. So basically, our classifications here, carnivore, omnivore, herbivore, are based upon what you eat and what species you come from. So even if one of you guys is a vegetarian, more power to you, good for you, you are still an omnivore. Just because you choose to eat all plants doesn't mean that you are an herbivore now. But if you belong to a particular species, in our case, humans, you will fit into one of these classifications. Now, some of the other kind of different groups. Scavengers is our fourth group. I call these the leftover guys. They are meat eaters, but they only eat things that are already dead. So they don't hunt. Vultures are the best known scavenger that's out there. We have vultures in our area. They don't quite look exactly like these. But vultures look for roadkill, right, or leftover dead things that other things have killed. They don't tend to go out and kill themselves. They just eat what's left over from other places. Now, our fifth group are the decomposers. I call these the breakdowners. They feed by breaking down organic matter into simpler compounds. So the primary decomposers are bacteria. If you have something that sits out and it rots, right, it decomposes. What that means is that bacteria are growing on it. Right, so if you have some rotten food or something that gets forgotten in the back of your fridge, the reason it starts to get nasty is because of bacteria growing on it. And what they're doing is they're breaking down the complex organic molecules in that living thing to more simple ones. Now, fungi are also decomposers in the soil, and generally what these are going to do is they're going to break down living things to form something called detritus. And detritus is just tinier pieces of dead and decaying plant and animal. So when something starts to break down and rot, it's going to get turned into detritus by decomposers. Now enter the detritivores. There are some organisms around us, I call these junk eaters, that eat detritus. So they eat this stuff. And these are organisms that sometimes you might not even, if someone were to ask you, hey, is that a carnivore or an herbivore, you wouldn't really know. And that's a decent indication that it is probably a detritivore. These are usually small organisms. These are usually small organisms that live in the soil. And what they do is they feed on these little broken down pieces of dead and decaying matter that decomposers release. So something like an earthworm crawling through the dirt is going to get its nutrients by eating this detritus. It's not going to hunt down anybody and kill them. It just eats detritus. A lot of other insects do this, things like mites and snails. Aquatic organisms like shrimp and crabs, you don't really think of them as living in the soil, but they do live in the sand, and they serve that purpose there, so they eat detritus as leftover. Now, one thing you want to remember is that the heterotrophic categories can be somewhat flexible. As we said earlier, all the organisms in one category might be different, herbivores especially. Right? Birds eat seeds, insects eat leaves. Maybe they feed on the same plant, but they're looking for a different part of it, so it makes that a little more flexible. Also, some organisms will not fit so cleanly into one category or another, or if it is necessary, organisms will kind of change their category. So for instance, carnivores. If there's not much food left to hunt, think like toward the end of The Lion King when Scar's been in charge and there's no food left. Carnivores will turn into scavengers if they need to, and vice versa. If scavengers are not finding food that they can just pick on, they will go out and hunt something before they would die. So those organisms kind of move back and forth. There have also been reports that organisms would, that as a carnivore would eat plants if they needed to survive, or a plant eater would actually eat animals to survive. We don't really see this too often, though. Cows are not going to wig out and start eating people or anything like that. So, but sometimes there's flexibility. And then, just to throw us in there, this is not something I'll test you on, but marine animals are really weird. So, aquatic organisms don't always fall nicely into one of these groupings because they might do all kinds of stuff to stay alive. So, that takes care of this first part of the notes. Hopefully, a lot of this you've kind of heard before, and that was kind of my hope here. So, go through these, start working on that practice packet, and then for homework, you're going to move on into the second part of the notes, which is going to get you ready for a lab activity that we'll do next time. Thanks for listening.